In the last segment, we talked about the representativeness heuristic. We talked about the three assumptions that seem to underlie it. You might think to yourself, well, does this heuristic even work? And it turns out, as long as these assumptions hold, the representativeness heuristic is pretty useful. For instance, the representativeness heuristic is useful in inductive reasoning when we're dealing with a relatively homogeneous population about which the reasoner has experience. For example, if you want to evaluate the probability of Chuck Heston's here belonging to the NRA, you might want to look at his obvious views on gun control. The same goes for when you want to determine if someone's a damn dirty ape or a constitution-ignoring, country-undermining liberal sissy. The representativeness heuristic doesn't always work well, though. Consider the following sequences of rolls of die. You roll your die, fair die, multiple times, and you get a sequence 1, 3, 1, 5, 2, 6, 4, 7, 3, 9. Or you roll it 1, 3, 4, 5, 2, 1, 6, 7, 8, 9. Or you roll it 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. Which is the more likely roll? Now, chances are people will pick either the first or second sequence because they look more random, and we expect random causal events to result in random outcomes. However, the third sequence is actually more probable. Every sequence of dice rolls with an equal number of throws is going to be equiprobable. And so looking random isn't really the determinant as to which is more likely. In this particular case, 666, 666, 666 is more likely because it has 9 rolls, whereas the first two have 10 rolls. And every sequence of 10 rolls is less probable in its outcome than every sequence in 9 rolls. Let's turn our attention now to another judgment heuristic, the availability heuristic. Like the representativeness heuristic, the availability heuristic takes a sample, measures the frequency in the sample, and then extrapolates that frequency in the sample to a frequency number in the population. So it works just like the representativeness heuristic and just like statistics, with the exception that the samples are different, the method of measuring frequency in the sample is different, and then the extrapolation between sample frequency and population frequency differs from contemporary statistics. So let's see how it goes in detail. When we use our availability heuristic, we make an estimate of the relative frequency of the occurrence in our sample. That is, all of our experiences in long-term memory. How do we make that estimate? Well, how easy is it for us to recall instances of it? How easy is it for us to imagine it happening? If things are easy to recall or easy to imagine, they must have happened a lot, and hence there's a high frequency in the sample. If they're hard to recall or hard to imagine, they must not have happened very often, and hence there's a low frequency in the sample. Once we have a measurement for the frequency in the sample, we extrapolate to the population, assuming that sample frequency and population frequency are approximately the same. So again, the availability heuristic works by that same inference strategy of going from a sample to a population, just like contemporary statistics and just like the representativeness heuristic. It too has certain assumptions, differs from the other two in the nature of its sample, the nature of the way it measures it, and then how it extrapolates from sample frequency to population frequency. So with our representativeness heuristic, there's an assumption that our experiences, as recorded in our long-term memory, are representative of the population. There's also an assumption that ease of recall or imagination is a perfectly valid measure of how often something occurs in our experiences. It's easy to recall, it happened a lot. It's hard to recall, it didn't happen much. It's easy to imagine, happened a lot. Hard to imagine, didn't happen much. Once we get that measurement for our sample frequency, we assume that it's approximately the same in the population. So let's look at some examples of the availability heuristic at work. So suppose I ask you which is more common in the English language. Words that have T as the third letter, like little or lot or hot. And words that start with T, like truck, tulip, tomato, tornado, and so on. Chances are, and most students who participated in studies like this said that words that start with T are more common in the English language. Words that have T as the third letter, less common in the English language. Turns out it's just the opposite. Words that have T as the third letter are more common in the English language than words that start with T. Why did we make that estimate? Why were we wrong? Well, it has to do with the way that we access our lexical store. Accessing our lexical store using the first sounds of words is much easier than using the sounds of words or the letters of words in arbitrary points in the word spelling. And so it's easy for us to recall words that start with T. It's harder for us to recall words that have T as the sixth letter. How about this one? Suppose I ask you whether or not violent crime is higher or lower than it was last year, or higher or lower than it was a decade ago. I used to ask my students this question all the time, and invariably what I found was the students tended to think that violent crime was on the rise. For instance, during the period between 2000 and 2008, students consistently reported they thought violent crime was higher, but it was actually on the decline during almost that entire period. Why is it then that students thought violent crime was more common? Well, in this case, violence is salient. So if something violent occurs around you, you tend to remember that more than when you didn't. So if you got mugged, say, for example, walking to the parking lot, you'd remember that night. You wouldn't remember the 100 nights you didn't get mugged. We also have a mechanism that reports violence to us all the time, i.e. the news. And so we get exposed to instances of violence all the time. They're salient to us, we remember them, and hence it's easier for us to recall instances of them, and so we tend to think violent crimes are high. In general, biases of availability are going to arise from the ease or difficulty associated with retrievability or imaginability of instances. If one finds it easier to pull examples of one thing from memory than another, then the first will appear more numerous, even if there are equal numbers of both. We might even suppose that this is what Shakespeare had in mind when he penned in Hamlet. We might suppose that this is what Shakespeare had in mind in Hamlet. Limitations of imagination based on innate dispositions, experience, and salience can introduce biases of availability. Such biases may well be behind that famous quote, "There are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy." People also regularly misjudge the likelihood of two events co-occurring, given the strength or weakness of their associations between the two. Insofar as the strength or weakness of the association aids or undermines ease of recall or imagination, these errors are the result of availability heuristic. Let's look at some examples. People in the US still tend to think that AIDS is a largely homosexual disease, despite the fact that most cases worldwide are the result of heterosexual transmission. Similarly, in the United States, people tend to underestimate the number of African Americans with college degrees and overestimate the number of African Americans on welfare.